United Nations Special Envoy Hans Grunberg concludes second week of bilateral consultations with Yemeni delegates over his new peace plan. Houthi militia continues to put restrictions on journalists and silence freedom of speech. Abduction of girls increases in Sana'a, which affirms the fragile security state in the rebels-controlled areas. Welcome to Yemen Today TV. This is the English news with me, Rushan Fuad. The United Nations Special Envoy Hans Grunberg concluded another week of intensive bilateral consultations with Yemeni delegates over his proposed peace framework. These consultations aim at debating and refining a multi-track plan, which is hoped to bring about an end to the conflict and achieve a lasting peace in the country. The following report has more details.
The Special Envoy for Yemen has concluded the second week of bilateral consultations with a wide range of Yemeni stakeholders as part of his efforts to inform his framework that aims to chart a path towards a sustainable political settlement to the conflict. He met with leaders from the General People's Congress Party and representatives of the Southern Traditional Council. He also consulted with security experts, including military and security professionals and civil society leaders. Discussions focused on the design, guiding principles, and elements of the multi-track process. They also emphasized the need for de-escalation measures, leading to a ceasefire as an important step for civilian protection and improving access for people and goods. All participants highlighted the urgent need to address immediate priorities related to improving the economic conditions for civilians and mitigating the impact of the conflict on civilians, while not losing sight of longer-term questions related to the final settlement of the conflict and the future of Yemen. Participants also stressed the centrality of reaching a regional and international consensus to end the conflict in Yemen. Discussions with security experts have also helped to articulate visions on how security issues could support the resumption of political negotiations. Participants underlined the need for addressing the root causes of the conflict and the need to support the local level security institutions to help restore the delivery of key services to civilians. They further emphasized the need to support security governance in Yemen and improve cooperation between civil society and security institutions in addressing human rights issues. The Special Envoy will continue his bilateral consultations next week with more Yemeni political parties, including the Rashad Union, different factions of the Supreme Council of the Revolutionary Al-Hiraq for Liberation and Independence of the South, the National Resistance Council, and the Southern National Council.
The United Nations welcomed the Gulf Cooperation Council initiative for Yemenis to hold peace consultations in Riyadh. The United Nations renewed its support for any effort which can lead to comprehensive negotiated political settlement in Yemen and put an end to the conflict, as the official spokesman stated. The General Secretary of Islamic Cooperation Organization welcomed the GCC Consultations Initiative. This came in a statement issued by the organization. It further called on all Yemeni parties to engage in the GCC initiative, stressing on its importance in stopping Yemeni bloodshed and reaching a political solution to end the conflict in Yemen. General Commander of U.S. Central Command said the Houthis are the most disrupting group in the region. He further explained that the Houthis are using the most advanced systems of drones, ballistic missiles, and cruise missiles. The general stressed that Houthi attacks are risking the global economy if they succeed in striking major oil and economic infrastructure. Since Houthi militia coup in 2014, journalists and freedom of speech have been subjected of severe suppression by the rebels. Further, a number of journalists have been jailed and tortured, and others have been sentenced to death. Despite the international calls on Houthis to stop such suppressive behavior, no progress has been made. More details on this are in the following report.
Journalists in Yemen suffer a bitter reality and a real disaster as a direct consequence of the lack of respect for freedom of speech and fear of the press and journalists in particular. Moreover, Yemeni journalists face social difficulties. Since the Houthi coup, the situation became more complicated for journalists due to the iron grip of the Houthi group in its dealings with the media, which amounted to forcing them to publish propaganda that incites war. Yemeni journalists are being targeted by everyone and have enemies who are trying to attack them in an attempt to force them to remain silent. The various powers and groups in Yemen have realized the influence of journalists. Their fears of journalists run so deep to such an extent that they are sentenced to death or killed, that always end up by being recorded as attacks by unknown criminals or are subjected to acts of attempted murder. Since the start of the conflict in March 2015, it has been documented that about 357 human rights violations and abuse against journalists, including 28 killings, 2 enforced disappearances, 1 abduction, 45 physical assaults, and 184 arrests and detentions. The safety of journalists is essential to the civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights of us all, and in the context of armed conflict they play an important role in uncovering the truth and holding the parties to the conflict to account publicly. Even though journalists in Yemen continue to suffer, they still hope for a better life.
Government forces announced the defeat of Houthi militants south of Ma'rib. The government forces held fierce battles against the Houthi militia, during which they managed to defeat the militia from several locations. They added that the government forces destroyed the combat mechanisms of the militia in the battle. Local sources said that Houthis are exploiting social funds in projects that set to serve the interest of community. Sources added that the Houthi militia seeks, through these projects, to transform mosques into headquarters for its members. Observers astonished at these funds squandered by the militia in projects serving the group, while refusing to pay salaries of employees and continuing to impose levies. Parliamentarians in Sana'a called for protests against the Houthi militia for the deteriorating living conditions of the residents. Representatives also called on residents in Houthi-controlled areas to implement a 2-day partial strike every week and stop buying goods whose prices are manipulated. The phenomenon of kidnapping young girls from the streets of Sana'a has documented an alarming record recently. Reports reveal that senior Houthi officials are involved. Further, such a phenomenon indicates to the fragile security state in the rebels' area. The following report has more details on this.
Houthi militias have escalated their campaign of brutality against women to new heights. Abductions of girls, female students, and women have grown to unprecedented levels in the Houthi-controlled Yemeni capital, Sana'a, according to human rights organizations. Kidnappings have also spiked in other militia-controlled areas. Local sources in Sana'a report that 2 female students were kidnapped while leaving their school at the capital's center. The crime comes at the tail of a succession of kidnappings fueled by security chaos. Sources said that armed men kidnapped the 2 students after they left Tahir al-Saifi school in Al-Safiya district. Following the 2 daughters' disappearances, the families went through security footage from the surveillance cameras installed in front of the school. The tapes showed several armed men kidnapping the 2 girls. Sources pointed out that the militia at the police stations had deliberately delayed releasing the videotapes, despite receiving reports from the families of the 2 students. The 2 families are currently living in concern over their kidnapped girls, in light of the escalating phenomenon of abductions in Sana'a and in many governorates under the control of the Houthi militia. It is worth noting that this is far from the first time young girls have been kidnapped in Sana'a, with some of the cases gaining international recognition. One such case is that of Iman al-Muqaddam, who was kidnapped in front of her house last January. Sources said that Iman was found in the kidnapper's car in the Mar, along with several other girls, days after the kidnapping. The militia has not disclosed the motive behind its abductions. Female students continue to be kidnapped from academic institutions and streets for ransom, due to false and malicious complaints filed against them and even for no apparent cause. Girls' lives continue to be put at stake due to lax security measures.
Internet users are complaining of Houthis restrictions on internet service in Aden. Internet users stated that the service has witnessed a significant deterioration, including social networking sites which hampered their work. They called on the Ministry of Communications and the government to take urgent action and end this continuous suffering imposed on areas under the militia control. Coming next. International experts voiced their concerns about the impact of the conflict in Ukraine on the humanitarian crisis in Yemen.
الراتب الواحد 120 ألف، والكيس الدقيق ب18 ألف، والكيس السكر اليوم ب20 ألف، كم يعني بيعطي هذا الراتب كامل كيس سكر وكيس دقيق؟
المواطن اليمني يعيش في أزمة إنسانية وغذائية مؤلمة من غلاء الأسعار وفحشة الأسعار وغلاء الصرف والعملة الأجنبية في البلد.
حالتي الحين حالة لما ندفناش القيلة ما نقدرش ناكل الأكل داخل، ما احنا بحاجة صعبة.
Welcome back. Since the war began in Ukraine, a number of international experts has expressed concerns over the deteriorating humanitarian crisis in Yemen. Such concerns have become a reality now, especially with the failure of Donors Conference last Wednesday to get the needed funding for aid programs working in Yemen. The Fund report has more details.
After an international pledging conference failed to gather enough money to prevent a humanitarian catastrophe in Yemen, the UN and aid organizations have warned of dire consequences. Overshadowed by the conflict in Ukraine, aid-starved Yemen, which is already experiencing the world's worst humanitarian crisis, is on the verge of total collapse, according to the UN. With the country almost entirely reliant on imports, aid groups predict that the situation will worsen as a result of Russia-Ukraine war, which produces nearly a third of Yemen's wheat supplies. Some 80% of its around 30 million people depend on aid for survival. After 7 years of a conflict that has killed hundreds of thousands of people, directly or indirectly. The UN voiced disappointment after Wednesday's conference raised less than a third of the target to help 17.3 million of Yemen's needy. The UN's World Food Programme has said the levels of hunger risk becoming catastrophic as the Ukraine crisis pushes up food prices. Even before the war happened between Russia and Ukraine, the WFP said Yemeni food rations were being reduced for 8 million people this year, while another 5 million are at immediate risk of slipping into famine conditions, which would remain on full rations. UN agencies had warned before the conference that up to 19 million people could need food assistance in the second half of 2022. The UN was seeking $4.27 billion, but raised only $1.3 billion, with some major donors going missing, including Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, who were among the top 3 at last year's conference. During the recent pledging conference, representatives from Saudi Arabia and the UAE stressed the need to stop the Houthis' terrorist actions, with the Emirati officials saying the rebels deviate aid. The humanitarian response in Yemen has turned out to be a disaster. Yemen has more individuals in need this year than it did in 2021. More lives will be lost if the international community does not act as soon as possible.
Food prices and basic commodities are witnessing high prices in areas under the Houthi control. The prices of most commodities and food supplies raised by more than 30%, despite the stability of the exchange rate in Sana'a. This increase of prices has reached services of all kinds, especially the transport sector, where the wages of internal transportation recorded a rise of 100%. As the holy month Ramadan sets in, food prices have risen to incredible levels. This has burdened people who find themselves unable to secure basic food for their families. The Fund report has more details.
7 years of war, a global pandemic, and inflation caused by Yemen's crumbling economy and exacerbated by the Ukrainian war have made it exceedingly difficult for people in Yemen to purchase basic commodities. Now, with Ramadan looming near in a country where 99% of the population is Muslim, Yemenis will struggle to put food on the table. Most Yemenis' daily wages are not enough to deal with the rising cost of living, and that makes shopping for essentials in preparation for the start of Ramadan a difficult task. A humble diet of bread and water is difficult to attain for many Yemenis who live in homes without running water, who have to trudge through the blistering sun while fasting to get to the nearest well. Bread has also become a luxury, as Moscow's invasion of Ukraine has prompted a global increase in grain prices for countries who rely on Russian and Ukrainian wheat. Furthermore, already high prices are expected to soar under increased demands, meaning many families would have to go without basic supplies like sugar and cooking oil, which are holy month staples. Yemen's pledging conference last week has amassed $1.3 billion in donations, a number which falls short of the requirement stated by the humanitarian community in Yemen by around $2.9 billion. The budget shortage means many families will be left to starve during Ramadan. Due to the funding gap, the World Food Programme has no choice but to ring-fence funds for 5 million people in Yemen who are on the verge of famine, leaving the remaining 8 million people with only half rations. Yemenis aren't just fasting, they are starving, without the promise of a hearty meal to tide them over.
The Ministry of Public Health and Population is launching the second round of polio vaccination campaign. This campaign is supported by the World Health Organization and UNICEF and aims to immunize more than 2 million children under the age of 10 in 12 Yemeni governorates. The Deputy Minister of Health called on the relevant ministries and local authorities to support the vaccination teams in order to implement the campaign. Houthi militia would not spare direct or indirect means in hand to kill Yemenis. Recently, they have prevented the entry of vaccines for children, especially the one of polio. This comes amid international reports warning from the spread of polio in the militia's controlled areas. The FANG report has more details.
The Yemeni government has held the Houthi militia fully responsible for the re-emergence of polio in the areas under its control, as it prevented the immunization teams from carrying out their tasks after Yemen got rid of childhood communicable diseases in 2006. Polio reappears in Yemen as a natural result of the militia's obstruction of immunization campaigns. The militia has continuously destroyed the medical sector, refused to cooperate with medical staff, and prevented vaccine entry into its areas of control. It is not the first time that the Houthi militia has refused to implement vaccination campaigns against epidemics and diseases threatening the lives of millions of Yemenis. The Iranian-backed Houthi militia threatens the mortality of civilians in various ways, not only through the war it has waged against the Yemeni people for more than 7 years, but also through depriving them of the most basic human rights, such as vaccination against a life-threatening epidemic. The Yemeni government called on the United Nations and its affiliates to disclose the practices of the Houthi militia and its continued rejection of vaccination campaigns in the country, especially those dedicated to combating polio. Observers believe that the militia's prevention of vaccination campaigns threatens the efforts made to protect Yemeni children from the spread of polio and constitutes a serious challenge for a country burdened with the aftermath of a ceaseless war and the health system's collapse. The international community must assume its responsibility to stop this looming threat that endangers the lives of Yemeni children.
Here is a reminder of the main headlines. Special Envoy Hans Gromberg concludes second week of bilateral consultations with Yemeni delegates over his new peace plan. Houthi militia continues to put restrictions on journalists and silence freedom of speech. Abduction of girls increases in Sana'a, which affirms the fragile security state in the rebels' controlled areas. This is the end of the news. For more, follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube at Yemen Today English. This is the end of the news. Thank you for watching.